My name is Miller Files. I have reopened many cases that the public believed were finished. Some were solved, some were buried, and some were never meant to be remembered at all. This is one of those cases. Washington 600 in the early 1970s was not the city you see in postcards. Beyond the monuments and marble buildings, there was another Washington, a quieter Washington, one that lived in the shadows of freeways and dim streetlights, a place where children learned early how to walk fast and look down, where mothers waited at windows long after their daughters were supposed to come home. This is where the Freeway Phantom began. They never gave him a real name because no one ever knew who he was. The newspapers called him the Freeway Phantom because his crimes followed the roads, the highways, the places people passed through but never stayed long enough to notice what was happening beside them. The first time the city understood something was wrong, it was already too late. A 15-year-old girl named Regina Harrison left her home to run a simple errand. It was the kind of task parents do not think twice about. She walked out into the evening and disappeared into a city that did not protect her. Her body was later found near a roadway. The details were brutal: strangulation, sexual assault, a life discarded close to traffic that never slowed down. The case should have shaken the city. It did not. At least, not enough. When investigators reviewed the file years later, one thing became painfully clear. The reaction was muted. The urgency was lacking. Regina was a black teenager from a poor neighborhood in Southeast 600. Her name did not dominate headlines. Her photograph did not stay on television screens. The city moved on. That silence was an invitation. Within months, another girl vanished, then another. Each disappearance followed a pattern that only became obvious after the damage was done. Young black girls, alone, walking short distances, running errands, visiting friends, normal childhood routines interrupted by a predator who understood exactly where to hunt. The Phantom was not impulsive. He did not grab at random. He selected victims who would not trigger immediate outrage. Children whose families had little power. Neighborhoods where police presence was thin and trust in authority was already broken. By the time 11-year-old Yvonne Bennett was taken, the pattern was undeniable. She was the youngest. Her disappearance should have been a line in the sand. Instead, it became another entry in a growing folder. When her body was found, it confirmed the worst fears of investigators who were already too far behind. The killer was escalating. The injuries suggested prolonged control, time spent with the victim. This was not a crime of panic. It was a crime of dominance. I want you to understand something important here. This killer did not just murder children. He studied the city. He understood its weaknesses. He knew which streets were poorly lit. He knew which neighborhoods would not flood police switchboards with calls. He knew which lives could vanish quietly. That knowledge is what made him dangerous. Washington 600 was changing at the time. The construction of freeways had divided communities. Roads cut through neighborhoods like scars. Those roads became dumping grounds, transitional spaces where a body could be left and quickly forgotten. Cars passed. People looked away. The Phantom used that. As the bodies accumulated, fear spread quietly through Southeast 600. Parents warned their daughters not to walk alone. Children altered their routes home. But fear does not equal justice. Fear without action only feeds a predator. Behind closed doors, detectives argued. Some believed the cases were connected. Others resisted the idea of a serial killer in the nation's capital. Acknowledging a pattern meant acknowledging failure, and then the letter arrived. It was sent to the Metropolitan Police Department. Written in an unsettling tone, that felt childish and mocking at the same time. Misspelled words, strange phrasing. The message was clear. He was watching the investigation. He was enjoying it. That letter changed everything and nothing. It confirmed a serial killer was operating freely. It also proved he felt untouchable. In my years as an investigator, I have learned one rule. When a killer writes to police, he is not confessing. He is performing. He wants attention, control, recognition, and most of all, he wants to demonstrate superiority. The Freeway Phantom believed the city belonged to him, and in many ways it did. By the end of 1972, 6 girls were dead. 6 families were shattered, and the killer vanished as suddenly as he appeared. No arrest, no trial, no closure, only questions. This is where the real investigation begins, because to understand who the Freeway Phantom was, we must first understand the city that allowed him to exist. And that is what I intend to do. If you want to understand a killer, you do not start with his fantasies. You start with his victims. You start with their routines, their lives. The moments just before everything stopped, because every murder begins long before the moment of death. The girls taken by the one they called the Freeway Phantom were not reckless. They were not running away. They were not doing anything dangerous. They were doing what children do when they believe the world around them is predictable. That belief cost them everything. Regina Harrison was 15 years old enough to want independence, young enough to still trust adults. On the night she disappeared, she was sent out on a simple errand, the kind of short walk that parents approve without hesitation. She never came back. When her body was found, investigators noted something chilling. There was no sign of a struggle at the abduction site. That suggested she went willingly or at least without immediate resistance. Someone spoke to her calmly. Someone she did not instantly fear. That detail matters. It tells us the killer understood how to present himself. He did not appear threatening at first. He knew how to approach a teenage girl without triggering alarm. He may have asked for help. He may have offered a ride. He may have pretended to be an authority figure. Whatever he said, it worked. Then came the death of 11-year-old Yvonne Bennett. She was walking to a nearby store, a distance so short it barely registers as a risk. She vanished in the space between familiar streets. When her body was discovered, the injuries showed something different, something worse. She had been held, not minutes, hours, possibly longer. This was not a panicked killer trying to escape detection. This was someone who wanted time, someone who wanted control, someone who wanted control, someone who was learning how far he could go. The next victims followed the same invisible script. Kathy Devine was 14. She disappeared at night after visiting friends. She was found strangled and stabbed. The wounds were excessive. Overkill that spoke of rage layered on top of ritual. By this point, the Phantom was no longer experimenting. He was refining. What strikes me most when I read these files is how predictable the girls' lives were. That predictability made them vulnerable. They took the same routes. They walked at the same times. Their world was small, and the killer mapped it carefully. He knew when parents would assume a delay was nothing to worry about. He knew when a missing child report would not be filed until hours later. That gap was his shield. Each murder taught him something. After every body, he adjusted his approach. Sometimes the killing was swift. Sometimes it was prolonged. Sometimes he dumped the body closer to the road. Sometimes deeper into isolated areas. He was testing police response, testing public reaction, measuring how much attention he could attract without forcing a full-scale mobilization. And for a long time, the answer was clear. Not much. These were black girls from Southeast 600. Their deaths did not dominate national news. There were no candlelight vigils broadcast coast to coast, no political pressure, no federal task force. The killer noticed that. I believe that awareness emboldened him more than anything else. When investigators finally began to publicly acknowledge a pattern, parents were already terrified. Girls were being escorted everywhere. Curfews were tightened. But fear does not erase routines overnight. Life continued. Children still walked. The Phantom was still out there. One of the most disturbing aspects of this case is the evidence that the killer sometimes allowed hope to exist. Some girls were believed to be alive for hours after being taken. Families waited by phones. Police searched neighborhoods. That delay crushed them when the truth emerged. Hope became part of the cruelty. The killer controlled not only his victims, but the emotional trajectory of their families. He created gaps of uncertainty that magnified the damage. By the time the sixth victim was found, the city was exhausted. Tips flooded in, but most were vague. Sightings blurred together. A man in a car, a man walking, a voice calling out. Nothing solid. The killer had blended into the background. That is the most dangerous kind of predator. One who does not stand out. One who looks like everyone else. One who can approach a child without raising suspicion because he appears normal. He was likely someone who lived nearby. Someone familiar with the area. Someone who understood the rhythms of Southeast 600 because he was part of them. He may have watched the girls for days, weeks, learning their schedules, waiting for the right moment when no one was looking. This was not chaos, it was patience. When people ask me why he was never caught, I always return to this truth. He did not overpower the city. The city failed to protect its own. Every delayed response, every dismissed concern, every assumption that these were isolated incidents gave him room to breathe. By the time the letter arrived, which I will address later, he had already proven his point. He could take children and walk away. The victims were not invisible because of who they were. They were made invisible by a system that did not prioritize them, and that invisibility became the Phantom's greatest weapon. This case is not only about murder, it is about neglect, about whose lives trigger urgency and whose lives do not. If you listen closely, the case files are screaming that truth on every page. 6 girls, 6 patterns of innocence, 6 warnings ignored, and somewhere behind all of that, a man who learned that silence was permission. There is a moment in every serial investigation when the case stops being about bodies and starts being about a voice, a message, a choice by the killer to step out of the shadows and speak. For the case of the Freeway Phantom, that moment came in the form of a letter. It arrived quietly. No dramatic delivery, no press conference, just an envelope addressed to the police. Inside was a page that changed the trajectory of the investigation while simultaneously revealing how little control authorities actually had. The letter was strange. The language felt childish. The spelling was careless. The tone shifted between mockery and calm explanation. It did not read like a confession. It read like a performance. He was not trying to explain what he had done. He was trying to prove something. When the letter reached the Metropolitan Police Department, analysts immediately noticed inconsistencies. The phrasing suggested someone with basic literacy who wanted to appear less intelligent than he actually was. That is not an accident. That is camouflage. Serial offenders often manipulate language to shape how they are perceived. In this case, the killer wanted to be underestimated. He wanted police to see him as sloppy or immature. That false image buys time, but beneath the surface, the letter revealed something else: control. He referenced details of the investigation that had not been released publicly. He commented on police progress with confidence. He positioned himself as an observer rather than a suspect, someone above the process rather than inside it. That is the mindset of a predator who feels secure. The most important thing about the letter is not what it said, but why it was sent when it was. By the time it arrived, the killings had already established a pattern. The city was anxious. Police were under pressure. That pressure is what he wanted to taste. Writing the letter allowed him to relive the crimes without risking capture. It extended the experience. It placed him in the room with detectives as they read his words. He was present without being visible. This tells us a great deal about his psychology. He was not driven by rage alone. He was driven by recognition. He wanted acknowledgement from authority, not forgiveness, not understanding. Recognition. He wanted police to know that he existed and that they were failing to stop him. That desire often appears in offenders with narcissistic traits. They see themselves as clever, superior, deserving of attention. The murders are a means to an end. The end is validation. But unlike some serial killers, he did not seek mass publicity. He did not contact newspapers. He did not demand headlines. He kept his audience small and specific. Law enforcement. That choice suggests discipline. He was not spiraling. He was managing risk. Another detail stands out when you examine the letter closely. There is no panic, no emotional overflow, no guilt, no fear of being caught. The tone is measured, almost relaxed. That tells us the letter was not written in haste. It was planned. Planning implies stability. This was not someone on the brink of collapse. This was someone who believed he could continue indefinitely if he chose to, which raises a critical question. Why did the killings stop? After the sixth victim, there were no confirmed murders attributed to the Phantom. The letter had announced his presence, but it did not precede escalation. It preceded silence. There are only a few explanations that fit the evidence. He may have been arrested for an unrelated crime. He may have moved away. He may have died, or he may have chosen to stop. The last option is uncomfortable but possible. Some offenders stop when the risk outweighs the reward, when attention becomes too intense, when routines change, when their sense of control is threatened. The letter may have been his victory lap, a final assertion of power before retreat. What troubles me most is how effectively it worked. The letter became the focal point. Analysts debated handwriting, vocabulary, grammar, while the neighborhoods that had lost children remained unchanged, poorly lit, under-patrolled. Vulnerable. The killer had shifted the conversation. Instead of asking why the city failed its children, we began asking who wrote the letter. That shift served him perfectly. In the years since behavioral science has evolved, we understand far more about offender profiling now than investigators did. Then, looking back with modern eyes, the Phantom appears calculated, organized, patient. Comfortable in his environment, he likely held a job, maintained relationships. Passed as ordinary. He may have been someone who children recognized from the neighborhood, someone who did not raise alarms. That is the hardest truth to accept. The most dangerous monsters do not look like monsters. They look like neighbors. The letter did not expose him. It protected him. It fed his ego while diverting resources. It allowed him to end the story on his terms. And for decades that ending remained intact, until cases like this are reopened, until silence is challenged, until the voice he tried to control is taken back. When a case goes cold, people often imagine a single mistake, a missed fingerprint, A witness who never came forward, a suspect who slipped away at the last moment. That is rarely how it happens. Cases like that of the Freeway Phantom do not fail all at once. They fail slowly, quietly, through a series of small decisions that feel reasonable in the moment and disastrous in hindsight. By the time the city acknowledged it was dealing with a serial offender, the damage had already been done. Early disappearances were treated as isolated incidents. Jurisdictions worked in parallel rather than together. Files sat on different desks with no unified command. This fragmentation mattered. Information that should have been shared was delayed. Patterns that should have been obvious were debated. Time was lost, and time was the one thing the victims never had. The investigative environment of the early 1970s worked against resolution. DNA analysis did not exist. Surveillance cameras were rare. Record-keeping was manual. Tips were written down and filed away. Many were never revisited. Eyewitness accounts were inconsistent. Memories shifted. Fear distorted perception. In neighborhoods where trust in police was already fragile, people hesitated to speak. Some feared retaliation. Others believed nothing would change, even if they did. Those silences were interpreted as a lack of cooperation. In reality, they were symptoms of a deeper fracture. Another failure lay in how the crimes were framed. Because the victims were young black girls from Southeast 600, their cases were not prioritized with the urgency given to other missing child investigations at the time. Media coverage was limited. Political pressure was minimal. Resources followed attention, and attention was scarce. This was not an accident. It was a reflection of whose lives were considered newsworthy. As weeks passed, detectives chased leads that went nowhere. Suspects were interviewed and released. Alibis were accepted without rigorous verification. Without modern forensic tools, investigators leaned heavily on intuition and experience. That reliance can be dangerous. In some cases, officers focused on individuals who fit outdated stereotypes while overlooking men who blended seamlessly into the community. The Phantom was not an outsider lurking in alleyways. He was likely someone who moved freely through the neighborhood without drawing attention. The investigation also struggled with geography. The freeway system created transitional zones that confused jurisdictional responsibility. Bodies found near roads raised questions about which unit should take charge. Delays followed as paperwork moved between departments. Meanwhile, the killer adapted. Every public statement taught him something. Every patrol pattern revealed gaps. Every delay reinforced his belief that he could stay ahead. One of the most troubling aspects of this case is the absence of a sustained offender profile during the active phase of the murders. Behavioral analysis was still in its infancy. The idea of systematically studying a killer's habits and psychology was not widely implemented. Had such analysis been applied earlier, investigators might have narrowed their focus to men with specific access to the area and the time to commit prolonged crimes. Instead, the net was cast wide and often blindly. Community relations further complicated the picture. Decades of mistrust meant that police warnings were sometimes dismissed or misunderstood. Parents tried to protect their children but lacked clear guidance. Fear spread without structure. The city was reacting rather than strategizing. As months passed and no arrests were made, morale dropped. Detectives were reassigned. Leads dried up. Files grew dusty. The Phantom receded into rumor and memory. When the killings stopped, there was a brief sense of relief. Some believed the danger had passed. Others feared the worst. But without new evidence, momentum was lost. Cold cases do not die. They are abandoned. This one was left behind by a system stretched thin and weighed down by its own blind spots. Looking back now, the failures feel obvious. The lack of coordination, the unequal valuation of victims, the technological limitations, the absence of a unified strategy. But what haunts me most is this. At no point did the city fully confront the question of why these girls were so vulnerable in the first place. Infrastructure decisions had isolated neighborhoods. Economic neglect had created pockets of invisibility. Social inequities had taught a killer where he could operate with minimal resistance. The Phantom did not create those conditions. He exploited them. Understanding that does not absolve him. It indicts everyone else. If justice had arrived swiftly, this case would be remembered differently. Instead, it stands as a lesson written in absence, an investigation that collapsed under the weight of its own assumptions, a reminder that failure is often systemic, not singular. And that is why reopening this case matters. Because until those failures are named and addressed, the story is not finished. Every cold case ends the same way, not with an answer, but with a choice. A choice to forget or a choice to remember, a choice to close a file or to keep asking questions that make people uncomfortable. This case never offered the comfort of certainty. After the murders stopped, the city tried to move on. New crises demanded attention. New headlines replaced old ones. The name the Freeway Phantom slowly faded from public conversation. But silence is not resolution. It is only distance. Over the years, investigators revisited the file again and again, each time armed with slightly better tools, better databases, better understanding of criminal behavior. Yet the core problem remained. There was no name, no confirmed suspect, no single piece of evidence strong enough to carry the weight of 6 lost lives. Speculation filled the void. Some believed the killer was a local man who died shortly after the crimes, a sudden illness, an accident, a death that erased the possibility of confession. Others thought he was arrested for an unrelated offense and spent the rest of his life behind bars under a different label. There were theories about military service and jobs that required night work and access to vehicles. None of them reached the threshold of proof. What is striking is not how many theories exist, but how none of them can be ruled out. That tells us how thin the trail really was. Modern cold case units understand something investigators in the 70s did not always have the tools to articulate. Patterns matter, but so do absences. The absence of continued violence after 1972 suggests a decisive change in the killer's circumstances. Death, incarceration, relocation, or a calculated withdrawal. Each possibility carries its own implications. If he died, then justice was denied by time. If he was imprisoned, then the truth sits buried in a different file. If he stopped by choice, then the most disturbing conclusion remains: that a man could take 6 children and decide when enough was enough. That possibility forces us to confront a deeper truth about power. The Phantom operated in gaps of lighting, gaps of patrol, gaps of attention, gaps created by inequality. When those gaps narrowed, he retreated, not out of remorse, but out of self-preservation. I have often been asked whether reopening this case can still matter. The answer depends on what we believe justice is meant to do. Justice is not only about punishment. It is about acknowledgement. It is about saying these lives mattered and their absence reshaped the city. The families left behind were never given that closure. They lived with unanswered questions and a quiet grief that did not trend or mobilize. Their daughters' names deserve to be spoken with care and respect. Regina Harrison, Yvonne Bennett, Kathy Devine, and the others whose childhoods ended on roads that were never meant to become graves. In recent years, renewed attention to historical injustices has brought cases like this back into focus. Cold case reviews have identified suspects once overlooked. Advances in forensic genealogy have solved crimes decades old. Possibility has returned to places once sealed by resignation. But even if this case is never solved, it still teaches us something vital. It teaches us that violence does not occur in isolation. It grows where neglect is normalized. It survives where voices are dismissed. It thrives where accountability is uneven. The Freeway Phantom was not a myth. He was a man shaped by his environment and enabled by its failures. Understanding that is not about excusing him. It is about preventing the next one. As an investigator, I believe memory is a form of resistance. To remember is to refuse erasure. To keep telling this story is to deny the killer his final victory. Because killers want silence. They want their victims to disappear twice. Once in life and once in history. We do not have to give them that. This file remains open, not because we expect a miracle, but because justice demands persistence, because even unanswered questions can guide change, and because somewhere in the city, those roads still exist, children still walk, and vigilance must replace indifference. I am Miller Files. This was not just a case, it was a warning, and warnings are meant to be heard.